January 1944. The Pacific Ocean is black and endless beneath a moonless sky. Far from any shoreline, a U.S. Navy carrier cuts through the water with its lights dimmed to pinpricks. On the flight deck, engines idle low. Deck crews move by memory more than sight. Every sound feels louder at night. In the darkness above, danger does not announce itself. There are no contrails. No sunlight to give warning. Only instruments glowing faintly inside cramped cockpits, and voices carried through headsets in measured, disciplined tones. Across the ocean, Japanese naval officers still believe this hour belongs to no one. For years, imperial doctrine has treated night-air combat as impractical, too chaotic, too blind to be decisive. American pilots, they assume, lack the skill and instinct to fight without daylight, but on this carrier deck, no one is laughing. The men preparing to launch are not chasing glory. They are waiting for radar vectors, trusting machines and training more than instinct. Their aircraft, the F6F Hellcat, sits heavy with fuel, armed, and ready to climb into a sky the enemy considers empty. This moment did not arrive by accident. It was shaped by defeats, misjudgments, and a war that forced both sides to rethink how battles would be fought when the sun disappeared. In the years before the Pacific War, Japanese naval aviation was built on confidence earned through experience. During the 1930s, Imperial Navy pilots had fought in China almost continuously, refining air combat techniques in daylight skies against opponents who lacked modern aircraft or coordinated defenses. By 1941, many Japanese aviators were veterans with thousands of flight hours. Their doctrine prized visual identification, aggressive maneuvering, and individual skill. Combat was something to be seen, felt, and mastered by the pilot's own senses. Night flying, by contrast, occupied a narrow and utilitarian place in Japanese thinking. Darkness was acceptable for transport missions, occasional harassment raids, or torpedo attacks by surface ships, but not for complex air combat. Without reliable airborne radar and with limited training infrastructure, night interception was viewed as inefficient. Senior officers believed that the confusion of darkness erased the advantages of pilot skill, turning combat into chance rather than craft. Victory, in their view, belonged to those who could see the enemy. When war came in December 1941, early events seemed to validate that belief. Japanese carrier aviation struck Pearl Harbor at dawn, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet before American airpower could respond. In the months that followed, Japanese aircraft dominated daylight skies over the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Coral Sea. American pilots, often flying outdated aircraft and rushed into combat, suffered heavy losses. The Imperial Navy's confidence hardened into certainty. Within this framework, American night fighting appeared almost irrelevant. The U.S. Navy entered the war without a coherent night-air combat doctrine. Radar existed, but it was bulky, unreliable, and poorly integrated into cockpit operations. Early American carrier aircraft lacked the range, speed, and climb rate to challenge Japanese fighters on equal terms during the day, let alone in darkness. Japanese officers studying captured equipment and intelligence reports concluded that night-air combat would remain a weakness the Americans could not overcome quickly. This assumption fit comfortably within Japanese strategic culture. Doctrine emphasized decisive battles fought under conditions chosen by Japan. Daylight engagements allowed Japanese pilots to exploit superior maneuverability and combat experience. Darkness introduced variables beyond personal control. Mechanical failure, disorientation, and misidentification. To Japanese planners, night skies were unsuitable for sustained aerial dominance. Meanwhile, the reality of war was beginning to shift. American industrial output surged in ways few outside the United States fully understood. Aircraft production accelerated, training pipelines expanded, and new technologies moved from experimental programs into operational units with unusual speed. But in 1942, these changes were still forming, not yet visible on the front lines. Early naval battles underscored the problem the U.S. Navy faced. At Coral Sea and Midway, American forces achieved critical victories, but these were won through intelligence, timing, and sacrifice, not air superiority. Daylight carrier battles remained brutal exchanges where losses were expected. As the war pushed westward across the Pacific, American commanders recognized a growing vulnerability. Japanese aircraft could approach task forces at dawn or dusk, exploiting low light to evade detection and strike with torpedoes or bombs. The threat was not theoretical. Japanese land-based bombers, often operating at night or in poor visibility, harassed Allied shipping and airfields from the Solomons to New Guinea. American carriers, crowded with fuel and ammunition, were particularly exposed during hours when visual lookout was unreliable. Darkness did not eliminate danger, it merely concealed it. By late 1942, it was clear that the war would not be decided solely by daylight battles. The Pacific's vast distances and unpredictable weather ensured that combat would spill into twilight and night. Yet the U.S. Navy lacked aircraft designed to fight effectively in those conditions. Pilots trained primarily for visual engagement found themselves blind once the sun disappeared. Japanese officers continued to dismiss the problem. From their perspective, American forces were reacting, not innovating. The belief persisted that night skies would remain contested at best, unusable at worst. That belief, shaped by past success, would soon encounter a navy willing to rebuild its methods from the ground up, because while Japan relied on tradition and experience, the United States was beginning to reimagine how air combat itself could function, without sight, without proximity, and without the assumptions that had defined aviation since its birth. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy accepted a difficult truth: courage and numbers alone would not secure control of the Pacific skies. The early months of the war had revealed systemic weaknesses: aircraft that could not survive sustained combat, pilots pushed into battle with minimal preparation, and doctrines shaped for peacetime exercises rather than total war. Fixing these problems would require more than incremental change. It would require abandoning assumptions that had guided naval aviation for decades. One of the most consequential shifts occurred quietly, far from the front lines. Radar, once viewed as a supporting tool for ships, began to move into the air. Early airborne radar sets were crude, heavy, and temperamental, but they offered something revolutionary: the ability to detect an enemy aircraft without seeing it. For the U.S. Navy, this technology aligned naturally with American industrial capacity. Engineers could refine equipment while training commands reshaped how pilots and controllers worked together. The Navy's solution to night combat was not to create lone hunters in the dark, but systems. Ground-controlled interception had already shown promise in Britain during the Battle of Britain. American planners adapted the concept for the Pacific, linking shipborne radar, fighter direction officers, and airborne interception units into a single operational chain. The pilot no longer relied solely on eyesight. He became one component in a coordinated network. Training followed doctrine. Specialized night fighter squadrons were formed, their pilots selected not for instinctive aggression but for discipline and precision. Night flying demanded restraint, steady hands, calm decision-making, and strict adherence to instructions. Mistakes were unforgiving. A single misjudgment in altitude or orientation could be fatal. The U.S. Navy invested heavily in preparing pilots for this environment, accepting that mastery would come through repetition rather than intuition. At the same time, aircraft design underwent rapid evolution. The lessons of early combat pointed toward survivability and firepower over extreme maneuverability. The result was the Grumman F6F Hellcat. Introduced in 1943, it was larger and heavier than its predecessor, the F4F Wildcat, but it was also faster, more robust, and easier to fly. The Hellcat could absorb damage, operate from carriers reliably, and, critically, carry radar equipment without crippling performance. For night operations, certain Hellcat variants were equipped with airborne interception radar housed in pods or integrated into the airframe. These aircraft were not elegant. They were functional. The additional weight reduced top speed slightly, but the trade-off was situational awareness in total darkness. Pilots trained to interpret radar scopes while maintaining formation and altitude, often flying on instruments alone. Japanese intelligence took note of the Hellcats' arrival, but largely interpreted it through a familiar lens. The aircraft was seen as an improvement in durability, not a shift in philosophy. Night fighting remained peripheral in Japanese assessments. Their own radar development lagged, constrained by industrial limitations and doctrinal resistance. Even as isolated night interception units formed, they lacked the integrated command structure necessary for sustained effectiveness. By late 1943, American carriers began deploying with dedicated night fighter detachments. Their mission was not dramatic. They did not seek large-scale dogfights. Instead, they intercepted reconnaissance aircraft, disrupted nocturnal harassment raids, and protected task forces during the most vulnerable hours. Success was measured in prevented attacks rather than visible victories. Gradually, patterns emerged. Japanese aircraft that once approached carriers unchallenged after sunset began to disappear. Some were shot down without ever seeing their attacker. Others aborted missions after radar-guided fighters closed in unseen. Reports filtered back through Japanese command channels, initially dismissed as anomalies, but the reality was undeniable. The night sky, once considered a neutral space, was becoming contested, and increasingly controlled. The Americans were no longer waiting for daylight to fight. They were shaping the battlefield around technology, coordination, and patience. As Hellcats continued to launch into darkness, the Pacific War entered a new phase, one where superiority was no longer announced by roaring formations at noon, but by the quiet absence of enemy aircraft at night. That absence would soon force a reckoning. The first angle was human, and it began in silence. Night fighter pilots learned quickly that darkness stripped away instinct. There was no visual horizon, no sense of speed, no enemy silhouette to trigger reflex. Inside the cockpit of a Hellcat, the world reduced itself to instruments, radio calls, and the faint glow of a radar scope. Fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as isolation. Many pilots later described the sensation as flying alone through empty space, trusting voices they could not see and signals they could barely interpret. Training focused on discipline rather than bravado. Pilots were taught to resist the urge to search visually for an enemy. Looking outside the cockpit could induce vertigo or spatial disorientation. Survival depended on obedience to altitude assignments, headings, and radar vectors issued by fighter direction officers aboard carriers or escort ships. In this environment, confidence was built not through aggression, but through repetition and restraint. The second angle was technological. Radar transformed night from an obstacle into a tool. Shipborne radar detected incoming aircraft at long range, allowing controllers to calculate intercept courses before the enemy approached striking distance. Airborne radar then took over, narrowing the gap until the pilot could bring weapons to bear. This layered system reduced uncertainty. It replaced guesswork with geometry. The Hellcat itself embodied this philosophy. It was not designed to outturn an opponent at close range. It was designed to survive long enough to finish the mission. Its powerful engine allowed stable flight on instruments. Its heavy armament, 6.50 caliber machine guns, meant that a short firing window was sufficient. In night combat, precision mattered more than prolonged maneuvering. Leadership formed the third angle. The U.S. Navy's decision to invest in night fighting reflected a broader willingness to accept calculated risk. Senior commanders understood that early losses were inevitable. Training accidents, operational failures, and equipment malfunctions occurred frequently during the program's development. But leadership protected the concept long enough for results to emerge. This patience contrasted sharply with Japanese expectations of immediate performance from new units. Commanders also recognized the psychological value of night control. Protecting carriers after sunset preserved morale and operational tempo. Pilots and deck crews slept knowing the task force was guarded. This confidence translated into more aggressive daylight operations, extending the carrier fleet's reach. By comparison, Japanese night air doctrine remained fragmented. Individual pilots displayed courage and adaptability, but lacked institutional support. Without integrated radar coverage or centralized fighter direction, night interception depended on chance encounters. Even skilled aviators found themselves searching empty skies while American fighters were already positioned along their flight paths. These contrasts revealed a deeper truth. Night combat was not about individual excellence. It was about systems functioning under stress. The Americans were building a framework in which average performance, repeated consistently, produced dominance. The Japanese, still focused on exceptional skill, struggled to adapt. By late 1943, the implications were clear to those paying attention. Control of the night did not announce itself with spectacle. It manifested in fewer alarms, fewer emergency launches, and fewer losses. For the enemy, it appeared as uncertainty, a sense that the darkness itself had become hostile, that hostility would soon be tested on a larger scale, as American night fighters moved beyond defense and into active interception, forcing the Japanese to confront an enemy they could no longer see or predict. From the Japanese perspective, night combat revealed the limits of tradition. Imperial Navy pilots were trained to fight with visual cues, using sunlight to judge distance, speed, and intent. Their doctrine assumed that air superiority was achieved through dominance in maneuvering combat. At night, these strengths diminished. Without reliable airborne radar and with minimal fighter direction support, Japanese pilots often entered darkness blind, guided only by rough estimates and scattered reports. Japanese leadership recognized the problem, but solutions were constrained. Radar production lagged behind American output, and existing sets lacked the precision required for airborne interception. Training programs struggled to adapt, burdened by fuel shortages and a shrinking pool of experienced instructors. Attempts to form night fighter units came late and unevenly, often using modified day fighters unsuited for prolonged instrument flight. Tactically, Japanese night operations relied on surprise rather than control. Aircraft approached Allied forces at low altitude, hoping to slip through gaps in detection. This method worked briefly, but as American radar coverage expanded, those gaps closed. The element of surprise eroded. Pilots reported being intercepted without warning, attacked by unseen opponents who appeared briefly, fired, and vanished. For American night fighters, interception became methodical. Fighter direction officers calculated intercept points based on radar plots, adjusting courses in real time. Pilots learned to trust the process, resisting the urge to deviate even when nothing was visible ahead. Engagements were brief and decisive. A single pass, a short burst of fire, and the encounter was over. Morally, the contrast was stark. Japanese aviation culture valued visible courage and personal honor. Combat unseen felt unsatisfying, even unsettling. For American pilots, success was defined by mission completion rather than personal confrontation. The absence of spectacle became a virtue. Victory was measured in prevented attacks and preserved ships, not in dogfight stories. This moral divergence influenced outcomes. Japanese pilots, trained to seek the enemy visually, sometimes broke radio silence or deviated from assigned routes, increasing vulnerability. American pilots adhered to procedure, allowing the system to function as intended. Discipline replaced heroics. As night interceptions increased, Japanese commanders faced a dilemma. Acknowledging American night superiority meant admitting a doctrinal failure. Yet operational reports increasingly confirmed the trend. Losses mounted during hours once considered safe. Reconnaissance aircraft failed to return. Torpedo bombers aborted missions after encountering radar-directed fighters. The tactical impact extended beyond immediate losses. Japanese forces were forced to reconsider timing and approach, compressing operations into daylight hours where American defenses were strongest. This predictability further favored the U.S. Navy, compounding the advantage. By early 1944, night had become a domain of attrition. Japanese pilots entered it with diminishing confidence, aware that the enemy might already be positioned in their path. American pilots launched with measured calm, supported by a network that extended beyond the cockpit. The night sky, once neutral, now belonged to the side that could see without sight. This shift set the stage for decisive encounters, where the balance between doctrine and adaptation would be tested under the strain of major fleet operations. By the spring of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a critical threshold. American carrier task forces were pushing deeper into Japanese-held territory, striking airfields, shipping lanes, and supply nodes with increasing frequency. Each advance stretched logistics but tightened pressure on Japan's remaining air strength. In this environment, the hours of darkness grew more dangerous than ever before. Japanese commanders understood that American carriers were most vulnerable at night. Fueling operations, aircraft recovery, and crew fatigue created windows of opportunity. Reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched after sunset to locate task forces and guide follow-on attacks. These missions had once proceeded with relative freedom. Now they were flying into a net. Radar operators aboard U.S. carriers and escorting destroyers detected contacts long before pilots could see them. Fighter direction officers issued calm, precise instructions, vectoring Hellcats toward intercept points miles ahead of the carrier formation. Pilots climbed into the darkness, adjusting instruments, listening intently as distances closed. When contact was made, it was sudden. Japanese aircraft often never realized they were engaged. Hellcat pilots reported brief visual flashes, a wing, an engine glow, followed by gunfire. Engagements lasted seconds. The enemy disappeared into the sea or clouds below. There were no turning fights, no pursuit. The objective was denial, not spectacle. These interceptions accumulated quietly. Each prevented reconnaissance flight meant an attack that never formed. Each destroyed bomber reduced pressure on the fleet. Over time, the cumulative effect reshaped operations. Japanese air commanders found it increasingly difficult to locate American carriers, especially during the critical transition hours of dusk and dawn. One of the clearest demonstrations of this shift occurred during operations in the Central Pacific, as American forces prepared for major fleet engagements. Night fighters flew continuous patrols, overlapping coverage to ensure no approach went unchallenged. The Hellcats' endurance allowed sustained presence, while radar coordination minimized gaps. Japanese pilots adapted as best they could. Some attempted higher altitude approaches. Others flew low over the water to evade detection. Both tactics proved insufficient against layered radar coverage. Losses continued, often without corresponding success. By this stage, Japanese officers could no longer dismiss American night fighting as experimental. Reports acknowledged radar-guided interception as a decisive factor. Yet institutional inertia limited response. There was no rapid means to replicate the American system. Training pipelines were depleted, fuel scarce, and industrial output strained by Allied bombing and blockade. The climax was not a single battle, but a realization. Control of the night equated to control of initiative. American forces dictated when and how engagements occurred. Japanese air units reacted, increasingly constrained by an enemy that could see in darkness. This realization came into sharp focus during large-scale fleet movements, where night reconnaissance failures directly influenced daylight outcomes. Without accurate information, Japanese strike planning suffered. Attacks launched blind or not at all. As American task forces advanced, the night sky ceased to be a refuge. It became a contested space dominated by invisible geometry and disciplined execution. That dominance would soon be tested in the largest carrier battles of the war, where night fighting ensured that the decisive moments arrived on American terms. The full consequences of American night control became unmistakable during the major carrier operations of mid-1944. As U.S. forces moved toward the Marianas, Japanese planners recognized the threat to their defensive perimeter. A decisive fleet action was inevitable. What they did not fully account for was how much the battle would be shaped before the sun ever rose. In the days leading up to the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese reconnaissance efforts intensified. Aircraft were launched at night to locate American task forces and relay positions. These missions were critical. Without accurate contact reports, coordinating massed airstrikes across vast distances was nearly impossible. American night fighters were waiting. Radar operators tracked inbound aircraft well beyond visual range. Hellcat pilots were vectored into precise intercept paths, often climbing above the enemy before descending unseen. Japanese reconnaissance planes vanished one by one. Some managed to transmit partial reports before being destroyed. Many transmitted nothing at all. When daylight came, Japanese strike groups launched with incomplete information. They flew long distances toward estimated positions, burning fuel and arriving disorganized. American carrier air patrols met them in strength. The result became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, but the outcome had been shaped hours earlier in the darkness. Night interceptions continued throughout the operation. Japanese aircraft attempting harassment attacks or late reconnaissance encountered the same invisible barrier. American carriers operated with increasing confidence after sunset, recovering aircraft and repositioning fleets without the constant fear of surprise attack. For Japanese aircrews, the psychological toll was profound. Pilots entered the night knowing they might never see their attacker. Traditional measures of skill offered little protection. Losses mounted without clear understanding of how or why they occurred. Confidence eroded. By contrast, American night fighter units refined their methods. Coordination between radar operators and pilots became routine. Intercepts were executed with efficiency that bordered on mechanical. Success rates improved as experience accumulated. The night sky became an extension of the fleet's defensive perimeter. The battle's aftermath confirmed the shift. Japanese carrier aviation suffered catastrophic losses in aircraft and experienced pilots. While many factors contributed, the inability to conduct effective night reconnaissance and harassment played a decisive role. Without control of the night, Japan could not shape the terms of engagement. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese night air operations diminished sharply. Remaining aircraft were husbanded for desperate daylight missions. Night skies over the Pacific increasingly belonged to American forces, patrolled by Hellcats guided by radar and discipline. The turning point was complete. What had begun as an experiment in adaptation became a cornerstone of American air dominance. Japanese officers who once dismissed night fighting were forced to confront a reality shaped by technology and organization rather than tradition. As the war moved toward its final stages, the implications of this shift extended beyond any single battle, altering the conduct of naval warfare itself. The immediate aftermath of American night air dominance was felt across the Pacific theater. Japanese naval aviation, already strained by losses in daylight engagements, now faced a battlefield with no safe hours. The night, once used to probe, harass, and regroup, offered no sanctuary. Each failed reconnaissance mission further isolated Japanese fleets and airfields, cutting them off from timely intelligence. Operational consequences followed quickly. American carrier task forces gained unprecedented freedom of movement after sunset. Aircraft recovery operations continued with reduced risk. Fleet repositioning occurred under the cover of darkness without fear of detection. This flexibility allowed commanders to dictate tempo, choosing when and where to strike with increasing precision. Japanese air units, deprived of effective night operations, were forced into predictable patterns. Attacks concentrated in daylight, when American combat air patrols were strongest. Loss rates increased. Experienced pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. Training programs, already suffering from fuel shortages, could not compensate for the attrition. Reports from Japanese command acknowledged the growing problem. Night interception failures and unexplained losses were noted, though explanations remained fragmented. The systemic nature of American radar-directed operations was not fully grasped until it was too late. Even when understood, replication was impossible under wartime constraints. For American forces, night fighting became institutionalized. Procedures refined during the Marianas Campaign were standardized across fleets. Night fighter squadrons expanded. Radar operators and fighter direction officers gained status and authority, recognized as critical to combat effectiveness. The system matured, becoming more reliable with each operation. The psychological impact was equally significant. American sailors and aviators experienced a shift in confidence. The fear of surprise attack diminished. Night became a period of controlled vigilance rather than vulnerability. This confidence translated into sustained operational pressure during daylight hours, compounding the advantage. Japanese pilots, by contrast, faced mounting uncertainty. Entering darkness meant confronting an enemy they could neither see nor evade reliably. Morale suffered. The intangible edge once held by veteran aviators eroded under the weight of invisible losses. Strategically, the shift accelerated Japan's decline in air power. Without effective reconnaissance, Japanese commanders struggled to coordinate defenses or concentrate forces. American strikes increasingly caught airfields and ships unprepared. The imbalance widened with each passing month. As the Pacific War advanced toward the Philippines and beyond, night control became a given rather than an exception. It shaped planning assumptions on both sides. For the United States, it was a foundation. For Japan, it was a vulnerability. The war had entered a phase where dominance was measured not only by what was destroyed, but by what never reached the battlefield at all. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the long-term effects of American night air superiority became embedded in every layer of Pacific warfare. Japanese naval aviation, once the spearhead of early victories, was reduced to a defensive force struggling to survive. The loss of night capability compounded existing weaknesses in fuel supply, aircraft quality, and pilot training. What remained of Japan's air arm operated under constant constraint. American forces, meanwhile, treated night control as standard practice. It no longer required justification. Carrier operations expanded to include continuous cycles of launch, recovery, and patrol that spanned 24 hours. The distinction between day and night blurred in operational planning. Radar coverage, fighter direction, and disciplined execution formed a seamless shield around task forces. Post-action reports from late-war operations consistently emphasized the value of night fighters. Enemy reconnaissance failures were noted as decisive factors in surprise strikes against Japanese positions in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The absence of early warning reduced Japanese reaction time, increasing the effectiveness of American air and naval bombardment. Japanese attempts to counter these advantages grew increasingly desperate. Some units experimented with improvised night tactics or radar warning devices, but shortages of equipment and trained personnel limited effectiveness. By this stage of the war, innovation could not keep pace with attrition. The institutional capacity required to rebuild doctrine had already been lost. The Hellcats' role in this outcome was emblematic rather than singular. It represented an approach to warfare that prioritized reliability, coordination, and scalability. While individual aircraft types evolved, the principles behind their use endured. Night fighting became less about heroism and more about integration, machines, people, and procedures operating in unison. After the war, Allied analyses confirmed what experience had already shown. Control of the night had protected fleets, preserved aircrews, and multiplied combat effectiveness. Japanese evaluations acknowledged the failure to anticipate and counter radar-directed interception as a critical shortcoming. The lessons were stark and unambiguous. These lessons extended beyond aviation. Modern warfare increasingly depended on information, detection, and coordination. Visibility was no longer a prerequisite for control. The night, once a barrier, had become a medium through which advantage could be exercised. By the war's end, the Pacific skies reflected this transformation. Darkness no longer implied uncertainty. It implied preparation, and with that understanding came a broader realization: one that would shape military thinking long after the carriers had returned home. In the Pacific War, victory did not always announce itself with explosions or turning battles in open sky. Sometimes it arrived quietly, through systems perfected far from the enemy's view. The struggle for control of the night revealed a truth that would define modern warfare: superiority belongs to those who adapt fastest, not those who trust tradition longest. Japanese naval aviation entered the war with experience, confidence, and a belief in the primacy of human skill. Those qualities had delivered early success, but they also hardened into assumptions. Night air combat was dismissed because it did not fit established doctrine. By the time its importance became undeniable, the resources needed to respond were already gone. The American response followed a different path. Rather than seeking to outfly or outmaneuver the enemy in darkness, the U.S. Navy redesigned the fight itself. Radar replaced eyesight. Coordination replaced instinct. Discipline replaced improvisation. The F6F Hellcat did not dominate the night because it was elegant or dramatic, but because it fit into a system designed for reliability under stress. This transformation changed more than outcomes, it changed expectations. Pilots no longer needed to see the enemy to defeat him. Commanders no longer waited for daylight to act. The night became an extension of the battlefield rather than its boundary. What made this shift decisive was not any single aircraft or battle, but the willingness to rethink fundamentals while the war was still being fought. In doing so, the United States turned a perceived weakness into an enduring advantage. When Japanese officers once laughed at the idea of American night fighting, they did so from a world shaped by past victories. By 1944, that world no longer existed. Above the Pacific, in skies without stars, control passed silently to those who could see without sight, and act without hesitation. That legacy would outlast the war itself, redefining how nations prepared to fight when darkness fell.